Now, this past weekend at New York Comic Con, Hasbro announced that they'd be making a 6-inch Black Series Kyle Katarn action figure, which is a character that I'm guessing a lot of you know or have at least heard of. And if you haven't, he first appeared in the game Dark Forces back in 1995, and he's appeared in other games as well as books over the years, though hasn't been seen in anything since the EU was discontinued over a decade ago. He has not appeared in the new Disney canon at all. Furthermore, in the past few years, Hasbro has released other figures of characters first seen in video games. We've even gotten a few from Shadows of the Empire rather recently, including Dash Rendar, which I personally got a few days ago and has made a fine addition to my collection. Another game or games that have seen characters made from it are the Knights of the Old Republic games. Heck, they've even, not all that long ago, made characters from Heir to the Empire, or the Timothy Zahn trilogy of books that came out over 30 years ago at this point. But what Hasbro hasn't made in nearly 6 years, ever since a Dark Side Rey action figure came out shortly after the release of The Rise of Skywalker, is any figure from the Star Wars sequel trilogy. And I do mean literally none have been made, not a single one. They haven't released a sequel character now in nearly 6 years, and they make a number of figures every year, somewhere close to 100 even. Put another way here, Hasbro, who has had the Star Wars license forever at this point, ever since acquiring Kenner back in 1991, they think, and I'm certainly not saying they're wrong, but Hasbro evidently believes making action figures from a 30-year-old video game that, let's be real here, a lot of fans never played and know little or nothing about, though yes, a lot did play it, don't get me wrong. They think there's more profitability making that character than making any character from the sequel trilogy, from the huge mainstream films that, comparatively speaking here, aren't really all that old. Basically, Hasbro understands that the sequels really don't sell, that some of the biggest Star Wars fans out there, and I'd argue those who collect action figures are more on the hardcore side of the fandom. Not that you have to collect them to be a hardcore fan or anything, but I think you get what I'm saying here. If you're buying Black Series action figures and putting them up on a shelf somewhere in your home, you're almost undoubtedly a big Star Wars fan. And as a big fan, you seemingly have no interest in any of the sequel characters. Again, you'd rather buy figures from a game that came out 30 years ago over the characters from the sequels. Or again, so Hasbro believes here, thus why they don't produce them, why they don't make any sequel trilogy action figures or haven't in roughly 6 years. However, Disney and Lucasfilm don't seem to feel the same way about the sequels. I mean, next week we'll see the release of the book The Last Order, which will be the first post-sequel trilogy story ever told. And if you're curious at all, it'll be about Finn and Jannah saving a ship full of kidnapped kids and then searching for the First Order officer responsible for their abduction, all the while having to come to terms with their former place in the First Order, or at least that's what the synopsis more or less says. But this is hardly the only post-sequel trilogy story coming. In fact, after next year's The Mandalorian and Grogu movie, which will be set in the same time period more or less as the series was, it looks like pretty much every planned movie after that, assuming the James Mangold-led Dawn of the Jedi movie never happens, which it looks like it won't considering he just signed a huge deal with Paramount recently. But assuming that film doesn't happen, or that the Dave Filoni movie that was announced at Celebration 2023 doesn't happen either, which we haven't heard anything about since 2023's Celebration, but assuming those films don't get made, or even if they do, everything else, all the other films such as Starfighter, which is already in production, and the Simon Kinberg trilogy, which is rumored to feature Rey and her new Jedi Order, it'll all be set post-sequel trilogy era. All roads will be leading directly from those films. Again, meaning that Disney and Lucasfilm believe that people will show up for them and pay for them, that something directly connected to the sequels can and will sell. Which again is not a conclusion Hasbro has come to, otherwise we would have seen something from the sequels, a figure of some kind from them in the past 6 years. And what they're probably thinking, what Disney and Lucasfilm are probably thinking or banking on or hoping, is that, as I've sort of joked before, that some of the more casual fans or average viewers will have forgotten how much they maybe didn't like the sequels and will go see new Star Wars just because it's new Star Wars. But they might be banking on the sequels doing what the prequels apparently did, where it seemed back in the day when they first came out that, quote-unquote, everyone hated the prequels, but as the years have gone by and as the kids who grew up with them got older, the narrative around the prequels changed and suddenly everybody loves the prequels. However, as I've argued before in other videos, I don't think that's exactly what happened. The people who didn't like the sequels back then still don't like them today, or maybe a handful have changed their mind, it's certainly possible. But they're just not very loud about expressing their disappointment in them anymore after 20 years. They have long since moved on from that. And the people who did like them back in the day, and I think there were more than some want to realize or believe, but they have an easier time having their voices heard on things like social media, which wasn't really a thing back then. I've always believed the hate for the prequels has been a bit oversold by the media too, which didn't like those films and have never exactly liked George Lucas either. The same way the media these days does kind of the opposite about the sequels and tries to undersell the hatred for them, claiming it's just a very small, angry, loud, angry minority of fans, and they do that because they're in the pocket of Disney or literally owned by them. And do keep in mind that time has gone by. The sequels are getting a bit older now. The Force Awakens will be turning 10 years old in 2 months, meaning the fans who found them as a kid or who grew up with them, who were, say, maybe around 10 years old when that first film came out, they're now in their late teens or maybe early 20s. They are certainly at that age where they could be making their voices heard on social media or elsewhere within the fandom. And in theory, they have disposable income to spend on something like action figures. But again, Hasbro doesn't seem to think they exist. With it indeed being the 10-year anniversary of The Force Awakens, it's the perfect time for them to do some sort of anniversary collection for it, much like they do with all the other Star Wars films, where they celebrate a big anniversary by releasing a slew of new or repackaged figures, and oftentimes on special card backs, but we haven't heard about anything like that for The Force Awakens, nor exactly have I heard virtually any collectors asking for that. And yes, I do very much keep tabs on the collecting community because I am something of a collector myself. Though, to present a bit of a counter-argument here, you could say that if you are around that age, around 20 years old right now, and you grew up loving the sequels, there's a really good chance you don't exactly have a ton of money to spend on action figures. You can't exactly afford them in this economy because they cost nearly $30 each these days. And yes, that is the price of a current Black Series figure. Not to mention, unlike previous generations, unlike prequel and original trilogy kids, action figures may not have been a huge part of your childhood. You don't have the nostalgia or sentimental value like the older fans do because they were the big thing back in the day. Especially for me as a kid growing up in the 80s, everybody played with action figures and there were a ton of different brands making them. Which is then also why 30-year-old characters from video games maybe sell better than sequel characters. Again, it's all about the attachment. They're being bought by, well, middle-aged men who perhaps have more disposable income and played with them as kids than sequel kids have these days, and Hasbro realizes all of that. They realize it's much more profitable to appeal to that older generation than to the young one with no money. But even if that all is the case, and I'd argue it is to at least some degree, maybe a large degree, but it still doesn't explain why the older fans don't buy sequel trilogy characters unless those older fans, well, quite obviously don't like the sequel trilogy. Perhaps the best evidence we can go with that a large majority of Star Wars fans don't like the sequels is the fact that, again, some of the more hardcore fans, those who buy the toys and collect them, seemingly have no interest in those characters. They don't want to pay for them, which again makes this decision by Disney and Lucasfilm to apparently go all in on the sequel trilogy a very curious one when perhaps there are some younger kids out there, or now in their, again, late teens and early 20s who will go see these films, but either way don't have a ton of money to spend on merchandise. But it's curious when the older generation seems to have little or no interest. I mean, just go into any store and tell me how much sequel trilogy merchandise you see. Any department store that perhaps sells t-shirts or whatever else it might be, you're going to see OT characters, you're going to see prequel characters, but how often do you see sequel characters? And so again, with the approaching 10-year anniversary of The Force Awakens, it doesn't seem like, yet anyway, people are coming around to the sequel trilogy, and that older generation in particular is going to be willing to spend money on them. It's going to be very curious to see how these all roads lead from the sequel trilogy movies do in the coming years. Well, that is going to be all I got for you this time. Your turn to take to the comments below and tell me what you think about anything and everything I had to say here. Everything from, what do you think of that Kyle Katarn action figure? Are you going to pick it up like I am? Or what do you think about Disney and Lucasfilm going all in on the sequel trilogy? Is this a mistake? Or are the fans out there? Is that younger generation going to take the fandom by storm in the coming years and make it seem like everybody has always loved the sequels? But whatever you think about any and all of it, leave those comments below. Let's talk some Star Wars. And until next time, thanks for watching.